Parshat Mattot opens with the following admonition. If a man vows a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. In the original Hebrew, lo yachel et dvaro, kechol hayotze mipiv yaseh. Some Parshanim posit that lo yachel is equivalent to lo yechalel, meaning he should not desecrate his word, implying that man's spoken word is sacred in the eyes of the Torah. It is a neder Adonai. Rav Halivni reflects upon the tension between the sacred nature of such commitments before God and Halacha's seemingly indulgent approach to holding people to their vows and oaths. On the one hand, Chazal were strictly inclusive as to the range of utterances deemed an oath or vow. Indeed, Rav Halivni quotes the first Mishnah in the Darim, which establishes that any phrasing that could reasonably be construed as a vow or oath should be binding as such. On the other hand, in recognition of the ambiguity of words and man's struggle with them, Chazal established a mechanism of Hatarat Nedarim that empowers a panel of three individuals or one Chacham to annul a neder, making it void ab initio at its inception. Under this construct, even intentional violations that occurred before the neder's annulment are retroactively expunged as if it had never been made. Which is it? Does Jewish law adhere to the proposition that words have inviolable sanctity? Or does it believe that words may be disregarded as if never spoken? Rav Halivni asserted that halacha strives to reconcile the two. Thus, Chazal balance between the strict meaning of the biblical text and the reality of human weakness and imprecision in the use of language. But how do Chazal square those two propositions that prima facie contradict each other? What is the legal theory upon which Chazal relied when they instituted Hatarat Nedarim, an apparent contravention of the Torah's admonition, Lo yachel et dvaro kechol hayotze mipiv yaseh? In the very next verses in Mattot, the Torah lays out Hafarat Nedarim by an interested party as the lone mechanism for rescission of the vow, further amplifying the problematic nature of Hatarah by the vower himself. Quote, if her father disallows her in the day that he hears, not any of her vows or of her bonds with which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord shall forgive her because her father disallowed her. Hafarat neder renders her unpunishable for transgressing the vow, but only from that day on. Still, Talmud in Masechet Nedarim attributes the phrase, and the Lord shall forgive her because her father disallowed her, to cases where the daughter failed to uphold the vow after the Hafarat neder, but prior to being informed of it, i.e., where she incorrectly believed that she was still bound to the vow, and nevertheless intentionally breached it. As Rav Halivni explained, even though the vow was canceled, her transgressive intention to break what she believed to be a valid vow is in itself unacceptable and thus requires God's forgiveness. If the rationale for Hafarah were the same as that of Hatarah, the daughter's vow would be void ab initio, ikara, as if it never had been uttered. Yet in Hafarat Neder, she is punished for violations prior to the Hafarah, and she requires God's forgiveness for transgressive intent after the Hafarah, but prior to knowing of it. Astoundingly, were the same daughter to later undertake Hatarat Neder for the very same vow, she'd become unpunishable for all prior violations and no longer need God's forgiveness for transgressive intent. From where do Chazal draw the authority to Laitil Neder, a self-initiated annulment of the very same vow, ab initio, ostensibly contravening the dictum of Lo yachel dvaro, while overriding the lone Torah delineated mechanism of canceling a vow, Hafarat Nedarim? The answer is implied in the biblical text and mirrored in the distinct rationale behind Hatarat Neder. A vow can only be self-imposed, Lo yachel et dvaro kechol hayotze mipiv yaseh. Its binding force derives from man's autonomy to self-obligate before God. The vower self-regulates dvaro, beino levin hamakom. Hence, as Rav Halivni suggests, the daughter's intent in doing so is key to determining the underlying validity and situational applicability of the vow, in the same way that legislative intent is key to determining any statute's applicable use cases and constitutionality. The woman is bound to the vow as regards the situations and actions she intended the vow to cover when she made it. Therefore, not knowing that it was rescinded by the father or husband, her intention is transgressive if she willfully acts to breach the vow. The father or husband resort to hafarat neder because they are confronted with the vow, binding her to act on that intention. That said, as Rav Halivni emphasized, self-legislated vows are bedeviled by the ambiguity of human language and forethought. People's vows imperfectly reflect intention and often manifest misguided will based on faulty premises. In Hatarat Nedarim, the vower asserting regret, charata, affirms and the Beit Din ratifies his or her realization that the vow was never a viable construct of self-legislation. It was flawed or ill-conceived at its inception. And had he known then what he knows now about the scope of possible circumstances covered by the vow's language and or about the unsoundness of the premises, he never would have made the vow. The utterance is hollow, chulin, ab initio, inasmuch as the self-legislative intent upon which it rested at the time was belied by faulty language and incorrect premises. At bottom, Hatarat Neder doesn't desecrate or break a vow or sacred commitment before God. On the contrary, it certifies that the utterance never met the strict standards to be a vow to God. A priori viability and compatibility between wording and intention. Shabbat Shalom.